On the side of the road, with sobs racking my body, I felt the enormity of my mistake. But here's the thing. Are you free? It took me more than 24 years and the loss of a dear friend to finally be able to answer yes to that question. Let me explain. The news Jack Buck died broke my heart. Now, sporting fans around the country knew of Jack Buck. Jack was royalty, but he was far from some distant celebrity to me. You see, Jack Buck was the reason that I'm alive. This was a man who learned about a tragic fire that had engulfed a 9-year-old boy the very night it happened. Even though he'd never met me, the following day he came to the burn center to visit. This was a man who lost his breath at that first sight. Before composing himself and pulling a chair across the floor so he could sit down right next to my bed. My eyes were swollen shut, so I didn't know who it was who just entered my room until I heard a cough, and then a very familiar voice. "Kid, wake up. You are going to live. You are going to survive. Keep fighting. And when you get out of here, we are going to celebrate at the stadium. We'll call it John O'Leary Day at the ballpark. It will make it all worthwhile." He left that visit, and I learned later on, he wept in the hallway. It was there that he was told by the staff that I would not survive, I would die. And yet, he came back the very next day, and the next, and the next. His voice became a constant during the 5 months I spent in hospital. This was a man who kept the promise of John O'Leary Day at the ballpark. He met our family at the stadium. He proudly pushed me around in my wheelchair. He introduced me to every Cardinal player, and he allowed me that evening to broadcast the baseball game. This was a man who, rather than accept that I'd never be able to hold anything with my damaged hands, sent me a baseball to my home the following day. It was signed by a Cardinal player, and it came with a note. "Kid, if you want a second baseball, you have to write a thank you letter to the guy who signed the first one." Ultimately, Jack Buck sent 60 baseballs to a little boy with no fingers, teaching me how to write again. This was a man who received the highest honor in Major League Baseball when he was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame and was given a crystal baseball to commemorate the honor. 12 years later, he came to my college graduation to drop off a gift. It was his priceless Crystal Hall of Fame baseball. I was 22 years old. I was directionless, unemployed, and probably still groggy from being out too late the night before. I had no idea who I really was or what I might do in my life. And he gave that crystal baseball to me. This was a man who struggled mightily with Parkinson's disease for years and then was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. This incredible man who was so full of life slowly withered in a hospital bed. As he suffered for 5 months in a hospital bed, the same amount of time, by the way, that I spent in a hospital as a child, how many times do you think I went down and visited with Jack Buck? The truth that I'm about to share still pains me 17 years later to admit. Not once. Not one single time. It was not because of my demanding schedule or indifference to all that he had done for me. It wasn't that I was ignorant of the mighty struggles that he was facing or because I was just too arrogant. I certainly thought of Jack Buck and I prayed for him every day during that time. So why not write him? Why not call? Why not just show up at the hospital, walk into his room, step through that door, pull up a chair, sit behind him, and say, "Kid, wake up. You saved my life. You are why I write. You are why I went back to school. You are why I am where I am today. You changed the arc of my life. Kid, are you listening to me? Keep fighting." Why didn't I do it? I never went down to visit my friend because I had an excuse we all use when we live in fear. I'm not worthy enough, and I'm sure someone else will do it. I kept putting it off. And then I missed my chance. Jack had died. You'd think I would learn my lesson, right? Well, 4 days later, as I pulled into the parking lot for his funeral, preparing to pay my last respects to this mighty man, to my good friend, It happened again. I took a deep breath, I straightened my tie, I turned off the car, and then I noticed walking past were the owners of the St. Louis Cardinals. They ran a billion-dollar business. They had influence, fame, and wealth. From the front seat of my beat-down Jeep, I began taking inventory of what I saw around me. Expensive cars, celebrities, current baseball players, former All-Stars, family members, in other words, Jack's friends. These were people of worth, of value, of substance, the type of people who had showed up at the hospital. They were the type of friends who were with him when it actually counted. I slumped into my seat, completely defeated. I looked into the rearview mirror, and I saw the kid that he visited dozens of times in the hospital. I saw a young man who did not visit once when the roles were reversed. I saw a fake, an outsider. I saw someone who did not quite measure up. I turned the car back on, I reversed out of my parking spot, and I drove away. Not only did I not visit Jack in the hospital, I didn't even go to his funeral. But this time, as I drove away, I knew what I was doing was wrong, and I began to cry. I thought back to all the times that Jack had visited, all the gifts he'd given, all the lessons he taught. How had I missed my chance to repay a small part of it? I had chosen not to show up, to never really thank him, to never even say goodbye, to never tell a man who loved me well that I loved him back. On the side of the road, with sobs racking my body, I felt the enormity of my mistake. But here's the thing. I made a commitment that day to never let it happen again. No more regrets, no more fear, no more hiding who I was and how I felt. I would never again pass up an opportunity to tell someone I love them, skip a chance to visit someone in need, overlook an occasion to utter the words, "I'm sorry," or "thank you," or "I love you." I made a commitment that day to live more bravely, fearlessly, and freely. I wasn't able to live like this while Jack Buck was alive, but he had helped me once more, this time in his death. The next evening, I took my parents out to dinner. It's easy to lose touch with those that you love the most in the busyness of our lives. I wanted to take the time to thank them for all they did for me. They had been my constant advocates during my darkest days and my cheerleaders during the brightest ones. They were my heroes when I was a kid growing up, but I wanted them to know that they still were. Those were hard words for a 24-year-old to say aloud, but seeing their faces afterwards saying them made it all worthwhile. Freedom. Later that month, Jack Buck's widow graciously met me so I could share the profound impact her husband had made on my life. While Jack, years earlier, had told Carol about what I'd been through, the fire and the recovery, he'd never told her about the repeated visits to the hospital. He never told her about John O'Leary Day at the ballpark, or the 60 signed baseballs, or the Crystal Hall of Fame baseball. Carol was blown away. She shared that hearing the story made her husband come back to life, at least for a moment. She hugged me and she thanked me. It was more freedom. I then wrote Jack Buck a long letter of apology for not being the friend to him that he'd been to me. I recounted all the things that he'd done for me as a child, all the times that he visited, all the love he'd given me, and how those actions changed my life. With that letter in hand, I took his son, Joe Buck, out to coffee. With tears clouding my eyes, I read the long letter I wrote to his dad. It was difficult to get through, but it was also incredibly liberating. There was more freedom. As a burn patient, I had vowed that when I got out of the hospital, I was never going to go back. That intense fear of hospitals and that painful memory of what I endured, it lingered. It was one more layer that had kept me from showing up to visit Jack Buck in hospital. But I was no longer going to let that fear keep me from entering into important moments in the lives of the people that I loved most. Sometimes the very best way to overcome a fear is to dive directly into it. So I trained for 12 months to become a hospital chaplain and spent 3 amazing years visiting with kids just like me, who were facing extreme difficulty, but who were also learning firsthand the power of genuine courage, resiliency, and hope. You guessed it, more freedom. And finally, It's why when Beth and I were blessed with our first child, we sought the name of someone that we hoped and wished and dreamed that he might emulate. So we named our son Jack. Jack Buck influenced me profoundly during his life, but ironically, he may have saved his greatest lesson for me for after his death. You see, when I was in the hospital, he began every visit with the words, "Kid, wake up." It took Jack's death for me to finally heed those words. I stopped living chained to the bench. I finally stepped forward and owned that my life may not be exactly what I expected it to be, but it was still a gift, and it could be used for good. In my new book, In Awe, I'll challenge you to refuse giving in to fear. I'll encourage you to start risking bigger, daring greatly, accepting accountability, and embracing the profound gift that your life is. You'll see that this is the time, that you are the one, that you are enough, and that the best is truly yet to come. Kid, I'm looking forward to continuing the journey with you.